One of the most significant casualties of the coronavirus pandemic may be the hard-won advancements in gender equality, as more women find their place in the workforce at a greater risk. How can we avoid the pandemic setting back the progress made towards an inclusive development? For a discussion, the head of the Gender and Economic Inclusion at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Ms. Barbara Rambousek, joins me from London. Ms. Rambousek, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
The economic challenge that was created by the coronavirus pandemic has hit the women especially hard, and there are alarming reports of women's participation in the workforce dropping visibly. How big is the risk of the pandemic reversing some of the hard-won advancements in the gender economic parity?
Thank you very much for having me here today and for discussing this very important topic. I think the challenges and the risks of inequality being going backwards is actually very high. We know that pandemics do have an impact on reversing inequality, and I think this pandemic and this crisis that we see at the moment is no different here. We see women being, I don't want to say forced, but going back and being pushed back into more traditional roles. We see women picking up the vast majority and certainly the lion's share of care responsibilities that are increasing now across the world. We also know that women are employed in sectors that are a lot more affected by the pandemic. We know that women tend to earn less in general. They tend to save less. They are also more often employed in informal settings with no or very little social security networks. And as entrepreneurs, they actually find it much harder to access finance, the advisory support and other support that is required, particularly during the times of crisis. So women are affected across a wide range of areas, from the sort of working life to their personal lives, their home lives. We also know that incidents of gender-based violence and harassment have gone up, particularly in the homes. So the situation is very difficult for women now across the world. And therefore, I think a focus on integrating gender into crisis responses is even more important.
Ms. Rambousek, healthcare workers are at the front line of the fight against the pandemic. 70% of the healthcare professionals in the world are women, and they only occupy about 25% of management jobs in the healthcare systems. How do we make sure at this time that these working women receive enough support when they're not always the ones that are making the decisions and they're not always involved in shaping policies?
So I think there are a number of areas that we need to focus on. First is a focus on skills, upskilling and reskilling to make sure that women have the right skills, new skills that are needed in this pandemic in order to be able to do the jobs. Another area is the social environment care provision. We need to make sure that childcare provision is available, remains open, and it also remains affordable to ensure that women are able to do the jobs that they are educated and qualified to do. Another area is we need to look at workforce conditions to ensure that gender-based violence and harassment is tackled and addressed very forcefully at all levels and in all sectors as and where it occurs. We need to look at equal pay for equal work. We need to make sure that remuneration is adequate. And that women get the pay that they deserve for the jobs that they do. We also need to support women, and we also need to support healthcare providers and companies to ensure that women have access to promotions, that they have access to mentoring and support in their careers to actually rise to the management positions that you rightly say women are underrepresented in, and that women can actually be much more able to shape their working conditions and the responses that are happening. And then finally, I think on a policy level, it's very important to work with health authorities, to work with education authorities, labour ministries, to make sure that labour standards, labour regulations have equality of opportunity at their centre, create an equal playing field for men and women across all types of job opportunities in the healthcare sector and more broadly, actually.
Mothers seem to have been hit even more so. Even in families where both parents are working, mothers tend to bear the majority of childcare at the moment. Women spend 2.5 hours more on chores on average daily compared to men. Now with the pandemic, that pressure and that burden has been disproportionately placed on the shoulders of the mothers and women. How do we change that?
So you're right. I think the care burden has gone up substantially for women. We know from around the world globally, women do 75% of all unpaid care work compared to 34% of men. So there's a huge discrepancy here. And this work is not paid, but it's also not recognized and very often not valued. So I think there is a big policy response that is required to equalize that care burden. This all starts already with shared parental leave, for example. So it's not about maternity leave. It's not very often about extending maternity leave. It is about all in society, men and women alike, to take the responsibility for raising the next generation. I think that's a very, very important focus and one that we certainly support very strongly in the engagements we have with our countries of operation. Another area is also on a corporate level, on a company level, to work with companies to offer not just maternity leave, but to offer parental leave, to incentivize parental leave, to encourage parental leave, particularly for fathers, for men, for male carers. It's very important that this is not just the exception, but this becomes the norm.
Well, in countries where parental leave is available, and even in companies where parental leave is available to both parents, like is the situation in Kazakhstan, there's still a very little number of fathers who actually take advantage of a parental leave and actually would spend time taking care of their children. And that is often there's a cultural element to that. It's an imperative for women taking a leave from work to childcare. How dangerous that mentality is in the long term?
So I think social norms are very sticky. Social norms don't tend to change very quickly. And unfortunately, as I said at the start, crises and pandemics, well, actually, sometimes they can accelerate social change, but sometimes they can also reverse social change. And I think with the current situation, what we see is a real danger that social change is being reversed and that women are being, forced back, pushed back into more traditional roles. So the way we can address that is through awareness raising, through role models, but also through policy frameworks that encourage this sharing. And we've discussed some of those already now. But I think the onus is very much on everybody to create an environment in their personal spheres, but also, of course, in business, in the relevant industries, and through the policy frameworks to foster this social change. The question is always, do laws change social norms, or do social norms change laws? I think it's a bit of both. It goes in both directions, but fundamentally the gist and the direction of travel needs to remain towards inequality, towards reducing the barriers that particularly women face.
But even in the most modern families, men's career seems to precede over women's career. And that ultimately affects the way parents approach children's education, boys versus girls, and how they perceive women's careers versus men's careers. How far have we come in these terms, and where do you see the change starting?
So I think we have actually come quite a long way already. If we look globally, if we look at educational outcomes and educational attainment, women and girls have caught up substantially. If we look at primary education and to some extent also secondary education, women now perform, or girls perform, at a par with boys and with men. And that includes disciplines such as STEM, sort of science, technology, and engineering and math. So disciplines that were typically associated with men. Women are certainly at a par and sometimes even outperforming men or boys in some of these areas. The important challenge that still exists is to then take the skills that women have acquired and turn those into careers. And here we still face a number of breaking points. The first breaking point very often is the point of marriage. In many cultures, there is still an expectation on young women to then leave the labor market or substantially reduce their hours. The second point is, of course, the first child, where many women tend to go part-time or leave the workforce altogether, or also to change careers into less away from technical jobs, away from high-paying jobs, into less demanding jobs that may provide more time flexibility and maybe also part-time hours, but certainly do not have the same career trajectory that other types of jobs could have. So I think the gains are there, they have been made, but I think there is still a lot more room to create equal access to equal opportunity.
Besides the cultural part of it or the social norms of it, there's also an economic rationale oftentimes when families make a decision between two careers, men's and women's, because oftentimes men make more money than women do. So in Kazakhstan, on average, a woman makes 31% less than a man does. How will the pandemic affect the efforts in narrowing the wage gap between genders?
I think the wage gap is due to a number of different factors. First, that women very often self-select or are selected into lower-paying roles, as we just discussed, but also that women perform part-time roles. And then, of course, there's still the issue of unequal pay for equal work. So we have a number of combinations here and a number of factors that come together. If we now look at that in the context of the pandemic, women are substantially more likely, first, to be in jobs that are affected by the crisis, but also to reduce their hours or actually drop out of the labor market altogether as a direct result of the pandemic. And that, of course, increases the pay gap. That, of course, diminishes opportunities for future promotion. If you leave the labor market, if you leave your job for a year or two, you will have the consequences in terms of your lifetime earnings, but also in terms of your immediate job progression routes and opportunities. So we do see a regressive effect in this context. And I think this is something that we really need to watch out very closely and specifically encourage women to remain in the labor market, to create the conditions where possible to allow them to do that. And I think fast testing and tracing and childcare and having childcare opportunities and facilities open lie at the heart of this.
Ms. Rambousek, in Kazakhstan, more than 50% of government jobs are taken by women, but women hold less than 10% of political positions. Only 26% of seats in parliament are taken by women, and only 24% of decision-making roles are taken by women in the banking system. So with women underrepresented in the leadership roles, how do we ensure that policy decisions, both in the government and in the corporate world, are made so that the women's needs and interests are taken into account?
If we look at women in decision-making authorities and supporting women to actually shape policy responses, women to run companies, women to be in a position where they can actually influence the overall pandemic responses, I think the important thing here is to focus on all the means in a way that we have at our disposal. And that starts from specifically encouraging companies to ensure that women are represented on their boards. There are different ways of doing that. Some countries have adopted quotas, voluntary or actually mandatory ones. There are reporting requirements for companies to report on the number of women in their workforce, the gender pay gap that they record across their workforce, and then to take respective action. So I think particularly on that level, if we just simply keep doing what we have been doing, particularly now in the pandemic where we have already discussed all the impacts that this has, we will not get the results that we want. We will not accelerate a drive towards inequality. I think we need additional policy tools, as I mentioned, in relation to potential quotas and other encouragements to ensure that women have an opportunity to access these roles and make their contribution at that level.
How do we attract men to this conversation of an inclusive development? When we introduce quotas for women in parliament, or when we obligate companies to have women on their board. It almost seems like we're trying to take their jobs, and that may be the sentiment they may get from all of that. So how do we progress towards gender equity without alienating the men?
As humanity as a whole, we need everybody to buy into equality. So this is not a women's issue. This is everybody's issue. And I think the key message is that equality will make everybody better off. It will create economic opportunities, but also better social systems and frameworks for all of us. So this is not just a fight to support one group. This is in a way something that benefits everybody. What we do know also from studies and research is that for men, very often having a daughter and putting a daughter through education and launching a daughter into the labor market is one of the key factors that really sharpens their focus on gender equality and turns men who may have been less involved in this struggle before into strong advocates for gender equality. So I think we need to look at the fathers of daughters very much. But overall, I think the message has to be very clear that it is about giving everybody an opportunity to make their contribution and thereby making the size of the pie bigger than it was before. It's not about women getting men's jobs. It's actually about creating more jobs, more opportunities for everybody. And we can only do that. And we know we have the statistics and we do have the data about the billions of pounds or dollars that would be added to the world economy if women had an equal share. So we know that the economic case exists, and therefore it is about enlarging the pie.
Ms. Rambousek, thank you very much. This was very insightful.
Thank you.